You're not on the guest list, sir. VIP only. Now step back. The words struck hard in the entry hall, louder than they needed to be, slicing through the murmur of arriving guests and quiet classical music echoing from the exhibit chamber. Samuel Riggs didn't answer right away. He stood in place, a folded American flag cradled carefully in both hands, edges creased, cloth soft from decades of care. His coat, too warm for the August heat, clung to his shoulders, its cuffs frayed, one button gone from years past. The red carpet beneath him muffled the slight tap of his cane as he leaned, subtly, for balance. The young museum coordinator took a step closer. His lanyard badge bounced against his chest. I said, "Step back. You're holding an artifact that isn't yours." Samuel's brow furrowed gently, not in anger, but in confusion. His voice came low, steady. "I donated this 28 years ago. It flew over Hill 528, Korea. I was the last one left to carry it down. That doesn't matter today," the coordinator snapped, plucking the flag from his hands in one fluid, dismissive motion. "We're reserving the exhibit entrance for dignitaries and featured honorees. You're not on that list." His grip was too tight, fingers digging into the fabric as if to make a point. The flag sagged unevenly in his grasp, suddenly weightless without its keeper. Samuel's hands remained hovering in the air a second too long, as if he could still feel it there. Behind them, the noise of the crowd softened. A few turned to look. A little girl stopped mid-step and tugged her father's jacket. The father said nothing. The security guards, standing firm beside the velvet rope, said even less. The museum buzzed with celebration. New signs, new donors, new speeches. But outside the perimeter of welcome, the old man now stood alone. Samuel lowered his hands. His cane tapped lightly as he turned, one foot slightly dragging behind the other, old shrapnel buried in his right leg since 1952. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if to conserve not just energy, but dignity. The coordinator walked off without another glance, flag in hand like any other prop. And Samuel made his quiet way toward the exit, past a wall bearing a polished plaque etched with names from the Korean War. He paused just briefly in front of it, ran one finger, gently, across the second column, stopping on a name that matched the photograph in his pocket. And farther inside, just beyond the crowd, a man in a dark suit had stopped walking. He wasn't part of the ceremony, but he had seen the flag, and he remembered exactly where it had flown. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. Outside, the air was thick with August heat, the kind that didn't just press down from above, but radiated upward from the pavement, rippling like memory. Samuel Riggs stepped out of the museum's glass doors with slow, deliberate care. His shoes, polished but worn at the soles, scuffed softly against the concrete. He didn't look back. A wide lawn stretched before him, framed by marble statues and carefully tended hedges. Flags waved gently from tall black poles, their ropes clinking softly against metal, the breeze catching their edges in irregular flutters, almost like breath. At the far edge of the green stood a bronze soldier, helmet low, rifle resting at his boot. A plaque read simply, "To those who returned quietly." Samuel made his way to a shaded bench beneath the elm trees that lined the museum's path, the same bench he had used every year. It faced east, just where the morning sun touched the steps at 10 o'clock sharp. He'd timed it once, back when his legs worked better and the world moved slower. With a quiet grunt, he lowered himself onto the bench. One knee bent stiffly, the other barely wanted to follow. He settled in with a sigh, one that stayed in his chest more than it escaped his lips. Across the way, guests continued to trickle into the museum, smiling and shaded by wide-brimmed hats, pressed suits, and event day lapel pins. Samuel didn't wear a pin. He had one, a box of them in fact, tucked away at home in a drawer lined with an old undershirt. But today he had only his jacket, his cane, and the photograph. He reached into his pocket. The foil made a soft crinkle. A sandwich. Plain white bread, ham, and mustard, nothing more. He unwrapped it slowly, brushing a breadcrumb from his sleeve with the same care he once gave to polishing boots before inspection. Everything he did now, he did with reverence. Not because the world demanded it, but because the ones who had not come home deserved it. As he took a slow bite, a gust of wind stirred the nearby leaves. The elm branches swayed above him, casting shadows that danced across his shoulders like ghost hands. People walked past. Some offered brief nods. Others didn't look at all. A group of teenagers ambled by, phones in hand, laughing about something unseen. One boy looked toward Samuel and elbowed his friend. "Hey," he whispered loudly, not bothering to lower his voice. "Look at that guy. Looks like he walked out of the exhibit." They laughed. It wasn't cruel, not exactly, but it wasn't kind either. The kind of laughter that passed through someone without seeing them. Samuel didn't flinch, didn't react. He took another bite of his sandwich, then brushed the crumb from his jacket again, fingers moving slow, precise. He had nothing to prove, and nothing left to explain. Across the path, a museum staffer, a young woman with a walkie-talkie clipped to her waist, stepped out for a cigarette. She glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable. Then she turned her back and lit up, exhaling upward toward the overhang. Samuel's gaze shifted to the large banners hanging outside the museum's main entrance. They were new, bold, proud, and freshly printed, commemorating the forgotten heroes, a new chapter of honor. He read it twice, and then he turned his eyes to the base of the museum steps, where a brass plaque was embedded into the stone. The words, dulled by years of weather, still bore their message clear. The 2nd United States Army Signal Corps, Korean Campaign, 1950-1953. He had seen it installed himself, watched them lay the concrete, helped the groundsman lift the heavy bronze into place. Now nobody had mentioned his name, not in the program, not in the exhibit. He had not even been allowed inside. A man walked past, wearing a Vietnam veteran cap. Their eyes met briefly. The man gave a faint nod, not quite a greeting, more an acknowledgement. Samuel returned it. It was enough. He adjusted his coat against the sun. The fabric smelled faintly of old soap and something older still, cedar and thyme. He was used to waiting. After all, he had waited for winter letters, for orders that never came, for medics who came too late. Waiting was a language he knew well, and still, he waited now. Inside the museum, music swelled faintly, patriotic strings from the ceremony hall. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked. A speech was beginning. Microphones buzzed. Samuel placed his sandwich back into the foil. Slowly, deliberately, he folded it closed and rested it beside him. His hands, worn and mapped with old scars, came to rest in his lap. He didn't ask for recognition. But this year, for the first time, no one had even remembered to nod. He had been coming every August for nearly 3 decades, first with his wife, then alone. Some years he spoke. Some years he simply stood at the display of his old unit. A silent tradition, a ritual of memory, and this year it had ended without a word. He stared at the museum doors, now closing behind a new group of invitees. A woman held her child's hand as she stepped through. The child looked back at him, wide-eyed, curious, and then was gone. And still, Samuel remained on the bench, waiting. But somewhere inside, between the museum wings and the shadows of past banners, someone had stopped walking. Someone had recognized the shape of the old flag as it was pulled away, recognized the tension in the veteran's fingers, the slowness of his steps, and somewhere, something in that man's chest began to burn. But no one invited him this year. The sandwich sat untouched beside him now, its edges curling slightly in the heat. The foil crackled softly as a passing breeze lifted its corner, then let it fall. Samuel didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the doors, as if still hoping they might open for him. Not out of entitlement, but out of habit, ritual. 30 years makes a path in the heart that's hard to unlearn. He adjusted his cane so it rested against his knee, the rubber tip slightly worn from use, the shaft smoothed where his hand had held it day after day. Beside the handle, a small tag was tied with faded green string, handwritten in careful cursive. Property of Samuel T. Riggs, 2nd United States Army Signal Corps. The ink had begun to blur from age and sweat, but the name was still legible, just like the old letters back home, when names mattered more than emails ever would. Voices carried from down the sidewalk. A trio of museum workers rounded the corner, 2 men in matching khaki polos and a woman in dark jeans with a clipboard. They walked in a loose line, chatting between bites of food from paper wrappers. "I told him the list was final," one of the men said, chuckling. "Guy just stared at me like I owed him something." The other laughed. "Half these old-timers think we built the place for them. Some of them probably think their picture should be on the wall." They passed within a few feet of the bench. One of them glanced at Sam but kept walking. The woman said nothing, but the way her shoulders tightened gave her away. She heard it too. She knew. Samuel didn't respond. His fingers curled slightly against the bench rail, skin pale against the worn ironwork. A gust of dry wind stirred his collar. A few moments later, a soft voice spoke behind him, the kind that's used when someone isn't quite sure whether to speak at all. "Excuse me, sir. Are you okay out here?" He turned his head slowly. A teenage girl in a Navy volunteer vest stood a few feet away, clutching a clipboard of her own. Her face was kind but young, too young to carry the weight of what she was seeing. He nodded once. "Just getting some air." She hesitated. Her gaze dropped to the foil-wrapped sandwich, then to the empty spot beside him. "You don't have a reservation?" she asked, almost apologetic. Samuel offered a faint smile, thin, polite. "Used to have something better than a reservation. Had a reason to be here." The girl blinked, uncertain how to respond. "I'm okay," he said again, gently, sparing her the burden. She lingered a moment longer, then gave a small nod and retreated, her sneakers whispering across the concrete. As she turned the corner, she looked back once. Samuel folded his hands again. Still, he didn't eat. The sandwich wasn't the point. From the main entrance, applause erupted briefly, muffled clapping that rose and faded in seconds. Another name announced, another award given. A pair of museum guests stepped out into the light, laughing, a couple in their 60s. The man noticed Sam, slowed, and then pointed toward the sky. "Heat's a scorcher today, huh?" he called out. Sam nodded, the corner of his mouth twitching toward a smile. "Reminds me of Busan. August. Hot like this, but no shade to speak of." The man gave a polite chuckle, but it was clear he didn't know what Busan was, or where. He ushered his wife away, speaking low. Samuel looked down at the sidewalk. A dried leaf skittered across the stone in a burst of wind, landing by his cane. His eyes drifted to the main museum window. From his seat, he could see part of the exhibit, not the new banners or digital displays, but the old wall of photographs and medals. One frame had been shifted slightly out of alignment. He'd asked to fix it 2 years ago. No one had called him back. Behind the glass, he spotted a familiar silhouette. Colonel Mendez, still upright, still proud. Samuel remembered the man's voice like gravel wrapped in silk. They hadn't served together, but they'd shared reunions, whiskey on quiet nights, stories with weight. Mendez had a section of the exhibit now, uniform framed under glass, ribbons aligned with ceremonial precision. Samuel's own uniform? Folded in a chest at home, beneath a wool blanket he hadn't unfolded since his wife passed. He leaned forward slightly, adjusting the position of his cane again. His hip complained. Dull, deep ache that came with every storm or wrong step. He pressed into it anyway, breathing through his nose, still unwilling to give the pain the satisfaction of acknowledgement. A group of high school students approached the bench. Their teacher, a tall man in suspenders, gestured toward the bronze soldier statue. "All right, this one's from the Korean campaign, 1950 to 1953. Raise your hand if you've heard of it." Silence. One student raised her phone. Samuel turned his gaze away. Another figure exited the museum. A man in a finely pressed suit, speaking hurriedly into an earpiece. He passed Samuel without slowing, still talking as he stepped into a black vehicle waiting by the curb. The door clicked shut. Engine murmured. Gone. The sidewalk cleared again, and Samuel sat still, hands clasped, the sandwich beside him now warming in the sun. His cane, flagless now, leaned like a silent sentinel at his side. Inside, laughter returned. Music. Another toast. He'd sat through this same ceremony 28 times, but this time, they had forgotten to call his name. And this time, no one stood. Yet. The sun had begun its slow descent, but the heat lingered, nesting in the concrete, rising back up in dry breaths. Samuel Riggs adjusted his coat and leaned slightly forward, watching as a silver sedan pulled up to the curb. A uniformed valet rushed to open the door. From inside emerged a woman in a cobalt pantsuit, her smile wide, arms open to the waiting cameras. Behind her, the museum curator stood with practiced posture, clipboard tucked under one arm, cheeks taut from a permanent half-smile. He shook her hand with both of his, then guided her toward the main entrance, speaking quickly, the way men speak when they're eager to be heard by the important. Samuel's eyes followed them to the entrance, then down to the flag still cradled under the young coordinator's arm, now half-folded, sloppily tucked between a guest list and a gift bag. The corners drooped. The blue field was rumpled. A corner of red and white cloth trailed against the man's elbow as he spoke animatedly to a nearby reporter, gesturing toward the ceremony hall. Samuel rose slowly, his joints stiff from the long sit, the cane supporting him like an old friend. He didn't hurry. He never did. His steps were steady, purposeful, weighted by something far older than fatigue. The ache in his leg spoke plainly, but he ignored it. Pain, for him, was not news. As he approached the glass doors, the automatic sensors failed to register him. He paused, waited. A second passed, then another. The doors remained shut. Behind the glass, movement continued uninterrupted, guests chatting, music swelling, the click of heels on tile, the laughter of a boy with a tiny flag stuck into the brim of his cap. Samuel tapped the door gently with the edge of his cane. Once. A security guard turned. He was young, early 20s maybe, posture straight, jaw clean-shaven. His hand moved toward his earpiece, then stopped. His eyes flicked to Samuel's coat, then to the museum pass clipped to his pocket. Faded, barely legible. He opened the door a crack and leaned out. "Can I help you, sir?" Samuel nodded once. "I'd like to speak to the curator." The young man hesitated, looked back inside. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Samuel replied, his voice calm, low, grounded like soil. "Just history." The guard straightened, uncomfortable with the answer. "I'm sorry, sir. We're at capacity for this event. It's by formal invitation only. I can ask someone to—" "I've been coming here for 28 years, Samuel said. Not pleading, not angry, just fact. That flag, he pointed with a slow, sure gesture, was mine. It flew over our post at Hill 528. I folded it myself in the snow. It's part of the Korean wing." The young man faltered, and then a voice behind him cut through the moment like a blade. "We told you already, sir. You're not part of this display. Back off." The museum coordinator stepped into view again, voice raised just enough to draw eyes from nearby guests. His smile had vanished, replaced by tight irritation, the kind born not of hatred, but of inconvenience. Samuel's jaw set slightly. He didn't move. The coordinator gestured toward the crowd behind him, toward the cameras. "This is a live event. You were informed at the door. That flag is not yours anymore. It's property of the museum. Now please, step away." Something broke quietly in the air, not with sound but with stillness. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Inside, a few heads turned, most didn't. The young security guard shifted his weight uncomfortably, stepping aside as if the ground had grown unsteady. Samuel looked through the glass once more. past the banners, past the display tables, to the corner of the hall where a small pedestal had been placed. On it sat a framed photograph, black and white, edges slightly curled. 4 young men standing beside a radio tower in deep snow, rifles slung low, smiles crooked from cold and courage. He hadn't seen that photo since he'd mailed it in. He'd assumed they lost it, or forgot. He leaned closer. One of the young men in the photograph was him. He still remembered the day it was taken. The wind had been cruel that morning. A corporal named Hal had offered him his last cigarette just before the shutter clicked. Hal was dead 12 hours later. "I was there," Samuel said softly, almost to himself. "When we raised that tower, when the wires froze and snapped and we held them up by hand just to get the signal out." The coordinator was already walking away, shaking his head. "I'm not doing this again. He's not on the list." A couple standing nearby overheard. The man frowned. Is he?" "No idea," the woman whispered. "Probably confused. They get like that." They walked on. Samuel stood in silence. Then, a janitor, older, maybe in his 50s, appeared near the edge of the corridor, pushing a mop bucket. He paused, wiped sweat from his brow with his sleeve, and looked at Samuel. "I've seen him here every year," he said to no one in particular. The guard didn't answer. The coordinator was gone. Samuel turned back toward the bench. The doors eased shut behind him with a soft hiss, locking the cool, curated world inside. He returned to his seat, but this time slower. His shoulders hung lower. The cane trembled slightly where it touched the ground. He placed both hands on his knees and leaned forward, exhaling a breath that had been sitting in his lungs since before he arrived. No one had helped. Someone had laughed. And a memory that once belonged to the cold steel of war now sat on a pedestal, orphaned from its keeper. The museum doors closed behind him. Again. The bench had warmed under the weight of the afternoon sun. Samuel Riggs sat as though carved from the same stone as the statues flanking the museum garden, unmoving, yet never truly still. His breath came slow, shallow, each one rolling in and out like the tide that once lapped at a transport ship's hull, decades and lifetimes ago. He pulled his coat tighter, though the heat pressed at his back. The buttons slipped with difficulty into worn holes, fingers slower now, less certain. Still, he fastened each one. Neatness mattered, even if no one was looking. From inside the coat, he withdrew a small, time-worn envelope, the paper thinned at the edges from hundreds of thumb rubs. No address, no postage, just the faint, looping script of a woman's hand across the front. Hal, in case they forget. He opened it with care. Inside was a photograph, square, curled, black and white. 4 men shoulder to shoulder, a 5th standing behind the camera, preserved only by the smile they held for him. Snow dusted their helmets. One man held a radio against his chest. Another squinted from behind thick glasses. All of them wore the same distant eyes. Samuel traced one face with his fingertip, stopping just beneath the left eye. "That's you, Hal," he whispered, always blinking too slow for the shutter. A breeze passed through the elm branches, and one brown leaf let go too early, spiraling slowly until it settled near Samuel's shoe. A woman pushing a stroller passed by, speaking softly to the child inside. She gave Samuel a brief, polite smile, the kind offered to strangers on park benches, then kept walking. The baby looked back at him with wide, unfiltered eyes. Samuel smiled gently, folding the photo along its familiar crease and sliding it back into the envelope. He placed the envelope in the inside pocket of his coat, patted it once. "Still got your smile, Hal." The museum doors swung open again with a soft hiss, and a wave of air-conditioned chill pushed outward, sterile and scentless. Another wave of guests emerged, laughing and squinting against the light. Among them was a man with white hair and a burgundy tie, holding a program and gesturing broadly. Samuel knew him, not by name, but by the photograph he'd once posed for. This was the man who had spoken at the 25th anniversary ceremony, who had read the names aloud, stumbling on some, skipping others. Samuel had thanked him that year. The man hadn't remembered him today. None of them did. He leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees. His cane fell across his lap, balanced between his fingers and the bench edge. Still, the museum buzzed behind him, celebratory, curated, brightly lit. Inside that glass box, history had been polished and printed, names sorted, stories distilled into slogans. But outside, the man who had lived it sat unnoticed, or worse, dismissed. He shifted slightly, reaching down to adjust the hem of his pants, where they caught against the edge of his boot. The movement was slow, painful. Beneath the cuff, a line of old surgical stitching peeked from his sock, a reminder of Incheon, of ice-covered rock, of the ambush that stole his best friend's voice and left Sam with metal in his bones. Yet he moved with care, not to conceal the pain, but to contain it. Behind the museum's glass wall, a boy posed beside a mannequin in uniform, his parents snapping photos. The boy's jacket was too big, sleeves drooping over his hands. He saluted, grinning. Samuel watched in silence. He didn't envy the child, but something in his chest ached all the same. The child reminded him of James, not the general. No, James Carter, 17, fresh from Memphis. Spoke with a drawl that melted every order into a lullaby, the youngest in their unit, first to die. Samuel had written James's mother himself, in ink too shaky to hide his grief, told her how brave he was, how quick to volunteer, how still he lay afterward, as if finally sleeping. He wondered if she ever visited places like this, if she'd ever stood behind a velvet rope, searching for her son's name. Would they let her in? A squirrel rustled in the hedges beside the bench. Samuel turned slightly, watching it dart across the walkway and up into the elm branches above. He smiled. "Still got more fight in you than most, little guy." His voice didn't carry, not that it needed to. Another group passed by, led by a man holding a small museum flag aloft on a wooden stick. He recited facts loudly, pausing for questions. No one asked any. Samuel turned his attention back to the building, and for the first time in a long while, he let his shoulders relax. There was no more ceremony to wait for, no podium, no reading of names. He had not flinched, had not raised his voice, had not demanded his due. He had done what he always did, held the line. And somewhere inside the building, a presence shifted. A man in civilian clothes had stopped walking mid-hall, his fingers clenched quietly around a folded program, eyes fixed through the glass, recognizing the cane, the coat, and the flag that never should have left that man's hands. Inside the museum, beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Korean War exhibit hall, the crowd moved like river water, guided by velvet ropes, placards, and the soft voice of a hired docent echoing through a wireless microphone. The air was cool, scrubbed, perfumed faintly with fresh paint and linen. Spotlights washed over glass cases and digital screens, each display carefully arranged for maximum visual harmony. There were medals suspended on invisible wires, letters mounted under UV-protected acrylic, helmets, boots, rusted bayonets all labeled with neat little captions. Sacrifice, compartmentalized. But the man who had stopped walking wasn't looking at any of it. Major General David R. McKinley, United States Army, retired, stood motionless in the corner of the gallery, his arms loosely crossed, a museum program folded once in his right hand, crushed softly between his knuckles. His suit was dark, tailored, the lapel unadorned. His shoes shined with quiet precision, but his eyes weren't focused on any display. They stared through the museum's east-facing glass wall, past the engraved bronze panels and etched marble, out toward the man sitting on the bench under the elms. The general's jaw worked once, quietly. He had seen the incident. Not all of it, just enough. Enough to recognize the flag, mishandled and half-folded beneath some staffer's elbow. Enough to register the sharp, dismissive tone that followed the word now. Enough to recognize the coat, the cane, the slow, wounded gait of a man the world had started to treat as background. He remembered that walk. He remembered the weight behind it. The docent's voice floated back across the room. And this next case features correspondence between communications units during the second winter of the Korean campaign. Much of this equipment was donated by the families of soldiers lost in... He tuned her out. General McKinley stepped slightly to his right, until the edge of the display case no longer obstructed his view. The figure on the bench outside hadn't moved, still seated, head bowed slightly, a quiet monument of his own. His breath caught. He knew that man. Samuel Riggs, Corporal, United States Army Signal Corps, Korean Campaign, 2nd Battalion, Hill 528. The last time David had seen him, they were both buried in snow and sound, mortar shells falling like hailstones around the fractured tower site, radios down, half the squad scattered between shell craters and frostbitten scrub. And through it all, Samuel Riggs had stood in the open, splicing wire by hand, fingers bleeding through his gloves. Riggs had stayed behind after they called the retreat, held the wire together until the last convoy rolled out. The general remembered that transmission. A burst of static. Then Riggs' voice, firm as steel and ragged with pain. "Signal's clear. Repeat. Tower is transmitting." That message had saved lives. And now that same man was sitting outside his own legacy, turned away at the doors like an old coat left too long on the hook. The general turned slightly, scanning the room. The museum staff moved with gentle authority, adjusting displays, managing press, smiling for photos. They had done good work. It was clean, impressive, but it wasn't real. Not like the weight still in his chest. Not like the memory of Riggs crawling over ice with a severed antenna lashed to his back. David exhaled slowly through his nose. He stepped forward. A staffer turned toward him with a clipboard, mistaking his movement for interest. "Would you like to view the new digital memorial wall, sir? We just completed..." But the general's raised hand silenced the offer, firm but polite. The kind of gesture that didn't ask. It told. He brushed past the exhibit, his footsteps soft against the tile. Each step a slow decision. Through the glass, Riggs sat untouched, unnoticed, same as before. And in that moment, the general no longer saw the museum. He saw the perimeter trench at Chosun Reservoir. He saw the shattered helmet with frozen blood crusted along its edge. He saw Samuel Riggs refusing morphine, dragging a radio set through snow deeper than their boots, because there were men still waiting for coordinates, still hoping someone was listening. And now that same man was sitting beside a half-wrapped sandwich and a memory no one bothered to ask about. David McKinley's hand clenched tighter around the museum program. The paper creased with a sharp crack. He hadn't planned on attending today, hadn't wanted another ceremony, another speech, another carefully prepared quote placed neatly in a press release. But now, he was done being quiet. The ceremony had reached its midpoint, that perfunctory lull between the opening welcome and the keynote address. Guests milled about near the rear of the exhibit hall, sipping lukewarm punch from paper cups with gold trim. Someone passed out miniature American flags on toothpicks. A photographer crouched near the front to capture an angle of the new exhibit ribbon, still uncut. The crowd's noise bounced gently off polished walls, a low hum of contentment, of surface-level reverence. At the center of the room, a podium stood draped in red velvet, a wireless microphone clipped to its top. The museum curator approached it with a careful smile, one practiced in mirrors. He glanced down at the typed speech on his tablet, cleared his throat, and leaned in. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, members of the armed forces past and present," his voice rang out, amplified but hollow. "Today we gather to recognize not just those we remember by name, but the many who served in silence, the forgotten heroes of Korea's frozen hills, of fire-forged friendship, of the transmission towers that hummed messages of life and death through the cold." There was a pause for effect. He looked up, beaming. "And with this new exhibit, we renew our promise to honor every sacrifice, known and unknown, A polite wave of applause washed over the hall, coordinated more than spontaneous. The curator gestured toward the display, a section of the exhibit wall framed by a ceremonial ribbon and 2 decorative flag stands. Behind it, under dimmed lighting, the names of communications battalions blinked softly on an interactive digital screen. No one was at the touch screen, and we pay tribute to the brotherhood that endured, to the courage that carried us forward, and to the legacy we must preserve for the generations to come. A light murmur of agreement passed through the audience, but near the rear of the room, a figure had stepped away from the wall. He moved slowly without ceremony, each step grounded in silent authority, his hands at his sides, his jaw locked, his shoulders square. Major General David R. McKinley walked toward the podium without looking left or right. People parted for him before they even registered who he was. It wasn't the medals. There were none. It wasn't the uniform. He wore a civilian suit. It was the weight, the unmistakable air of a man who had once given orders that men followed into fire. The curator looked up mid-sentence. And so we dedicate this wing not only to our past. The general didn't slow. He reached the podium and stood beside it, his presence a wall. The curator stammered once, confused, still holding the microphone. David didn't reach for the mic. He didn't speak. He simply turned to face the audience. His gaze swept the room, calm, level. Then he pointed, not theatrically, not with anger, but directly, with the steady hand of a man who had once chosen landing zones with that same finger. He pointed through the glass wall behind the guests, to the man on the bench outside. The cane leaned at his side, the coat clutched closed, the flag no longer in his hands, the sandwich forgotten. And for the first time in 28 years, someone pointed to Samuel Riggs instead of past him. David's voice came low, but every word struck with the precision of a field report. A real hero is sitting outside this building right now, in 94-degree heat, eating a sandwich alone. The curator's mouth opened. No words came. David stepped toward the microphone, gently, deliberately, and the curator moved aside, swallowed whole by the gravity of what now stood behind that podium. The general's hands didn't shake. His voice didn't rise. He spoke like the cold, steady, final. He wasn't invited. He wasn't recognized. But without him, I wouldn't be standing here. Without him, a whole convoy of us would still be names buried in snow. And this flag, he reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a small square of paper, a photocopy of the very flag now stuffed under the coordinator's arm. This flag didn't come from some donation box. It was carried out of a crater by a man who had a bullet in his leg and blood frozen to his collar. The room had gone silent. One child's balloon squeaked against his father's arm, then nothing. David turned again to the staffer holding the folded flag, the same one who had pulled it from Samuel's hands not an hour earlier. "Put that down," the general said, not unkindly, but with finality. The staffer hesitated, then obeyed, placing the flag gently onto a nearby table. David looked to the security guard at the front of the exhibit doors. "Shut it down." The young man blinked. "Sir," the general repeated, soft but unshakable. "Shut it down." The lights over the exhibit dimmed. The touchscreen display flickered, then went dark. For a moment, no one moved. And then the general stepped back from the podium. No more words. He turned toward the doors, not rushed, not triumphant, just with purpose, and walked out. The museum doors opened with a gentle hiss, spilling conditioned air out into the heavy August heat. The moment the light shifted across his lap, Samuel Riggs looked up, slowly, not startled, not expectant, just present. Major General David R. McKinley stepped into the sunlight without pause. No entourage, no medals, just the same civilian suit, now touched with a faint sheen of sweat at the collar. His expression held no anger, no pride, only gravity. That old weight of knowing things others would never ask about. He didn't speak. He walked straight to the bench. Each step across the concrete path was quiet, measured, like footsteps across loose gravel on the edge of a battlefield. As he approached, the elm leaves whispered above them, shifting in the late afternoon wind. Somewhere nearby, a flagpole rope clicked softly against metal. Samuel tilted his head, shading his eyes against the brightness. "I'll be damned," he said, voice dry and thin as parchment. "Didn't think you'd come." David said nothing. He stood for a moment longer, just looking at the man before him. Then, without hesitation, he lowered himself onto the bench. He didn't rush. The suit creased along the shoulders as he settled beside Samuel, knees stiff, one hand on the edge of the seat. The two men sat in silence, staring forward, at nothing in particular, just the sidewalk, the hedges, the open space between museum and monument, between past and now. After a moment, David reached to his left, into the space between them, and placed the flag on Samuel's lap. It was folded with care now, sharp corners, tension in the crease, dignity restored. Samuel didn't speak. He looked down at it. His hands came up slowly, fingers brushing the cloth like old piano keys. He held it for a long moment. Then one hand lifted not to his heart, but to his mouth, just a gentle press of his knuckles to his lips, as if kissing memory. "I always said you had a good fold," he muttered. "Still do." David allowed the faintest smile to break the line of his jaw. Still, he said nothing. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full, packed with things that could never be said out loud. Nights where they listened for distant artillery, names called into static, the sound of boots slipping on ice, the pressure of blood-wet bandages, shared breath inside foxholes too small for fear. Inside the museum, no one moved. The entire crowd had drifted to the windows. They watched from behind the glass, but made no sound. Not a tap, not a word. It was as if the world had leaned closer, holding its breath. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of cut grass and distant diesel. Some truck idling far down the road. David reached into his coat again. This time, not for a paper or photograph. He withdrew something small, worn, wrapped in cloth. A chevron patch, faded, threadbare, from a torn sleeve. He placed it on the bench between them. "Hal's," he said finally, his voice low. "Recovered it after the blast. Kept it with me." Samuel stared at it. His hands didn't move, but his throat did. One slow swallow. "I thought it burned." "So did I. Found it in the snow, under a piece of his radio kit." Neither man looked at each other. They didn't need to. This wasn't reunion. This wasn't reconciliation. This was witnessing. Two men, once soldiers, now old enough to feel every inch of time pressing down on their shoulders, sitting on a bench, between the living world and the world that forgets. A nearby child tugged at her mother's hand, whispering, "Who are they?" The mother didn't answer, but the silence said enough. And then, without turning his head, Samuel spoke again. "You're the only one who remembered." David's response came not in words, but in motion. He sat straighter, not a full parade rest, just enough. His spine remembered the posture before his muscles did. And Samuel, he mirrored it. The cane stayed in his grip, but his shoulders squared, coat smoothed gently over his chest. They sat in that silence for a while longer. Two old men, holding each other's ghosts. Inside, the crowd remained behind glass. No applause, no fanfare, just faces watching, remembering. One woman, the same volunteer from earlier, stepped out of the exhibit and slowly approached the glass doors. Her walkie-talkie was turned off now. She placed her hand gently on the doorframe. She didn't open it. She just watched. And the general sat beside the corporal, and the flag sat between them. And the world, for one breathless stretch of time, knew exactly what honor looked like. The room inside the museum was no longer bustling. The crowd had drifted toward the glass like iron filings drawn to a silent magnet. No one had told them to gather there. No announcement had been made. But something in the posture of the two men on that bench had cut through the curated ceremony like a whisper through tall grass. Everyone felt it. The museum coordinator, the same one who had stripped the flag from Samuel's hands earlier, now stood beside the extinguished display with a clipboard clutched loosely in his fingers. The light above the touchscreen was still off. His eyes were fixed on the window, jaw set, arms folded too tightly. The retired general had not spoken again, nor had Samuel. They sat with the weight of 1,000 silences between them. Then the doors opened again, not for a guest, not for a speaker, but for the press. The reporter who had earlier walked away now stepped outside, a small camera in her hands, lens capped, microphone switched off. She approached slowly, her face open, not eager, not opportunistic, just present. "Sir," she said gently, addressing the general, "would you be willing to say a few words?" David turned to Samuel, a silent ask. Samuel gave the faintest nod. He didn't seem to do it for the crowd, or the camera, just because the moment had finally come. The general rose. It took effort. His knees groaned under the movement, but he unfolded himself with the same strength that once led companies through jungle and desert alike. He stood beside the bench, facing no one and everyone. He didn't look at the camera. He looked ahead, into the air, as though speaking to the unseen. His voice, when it came, was low, even, unshaken. "I was 9 years old when my father died in Korea. I never met him, only knew him through letters and photographs, and through the men who served with him." A pause, not for drama, for memory. One of those men was Samuel Riggs. The crowd inside had stilled completely. The coordinator's clipboard slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a soft clap. No one turned. David continued. "My father's convoy was hit by mortar fire in the hills outside Incheon. The lead vehicle exploded. Men scattered, screamed. Some never got out. The radio tower had been knocked out earlier that morning. They couldn't call for help, couldn't reach the base, couldn't move. They were stuck." He shifted slightly, shoulders squared now, voice stronger. Samuel Riggs was with the 2nd United States Army Signal Corps. He'd already been wounded, shrapnel in his leg. He was told to fall back. Instead, he crawled through the snow with an antenna lashed to his back, wired it by hand, spliced signal lines in a whiteout. He was 21. A rustle from within the crowd. A woman covered her mouth. A child stepped closer to the glass. David pointed once, not toward Samuel, but toward the east wall of the museum, where the exhibit's digital screen had once lit up with scrolling names. That signal got through. The base responded. A medevac came. My father was still breathing when they pulled him from the wreck. He died 2 days later in the field hospital. But because of that signal, I have his name. I have his letters. I have this story. He let the weight of that sentence settle into the silence like a stone sinking in still water. Samuel Riggs didn't just send a message that day. He gave a boy his father. He gave me memory. And then David turned. He looked at Samuel. The camera, still quiet, captured it all. He never asked for recognition. He never put his name on a plaque. He never claimed a title. But this man... David placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, steady, firm. This man is the reason I serve, the reason I remember. And if you forget him, you forget all of them. Inside, no one moved. Even the staff froze in place. Not from fear, not from guilt, but from awakening. The woman from earlier, the volunteer who had spoken to Samuel before, stepped slowly forward from the crowd and pressed a hand to the glass. She didn't speak. Her eyes glistened. She just watched a man finally receive the truth he'd carried for others for too long. And Samuel? He didn't speak. He simply held the flag tighter across his lap, not to possess it, but to protect it, like he always had. An hour had passed since the general's voice had turned the air to stillness. But time had bent in those minutes, not rushing, not dragging, just pausing, as if history itself had leaned down to listen. The museum staff had dispersed like waves after an undertow, quiet and unspoken. No one issued orders, No announcements echoed over the sound system. Yet beneath the surface of it all, something had shifted. The crowd inside no longer hovered around display cases or exhibit banners. Instead, they lingered at the windows, unmoving. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, bound by something wordless. They weren't waiting for the next speech. They were witnessing a correction. Inside the museum hall, the space near the Korean War wing grew heavy with silence. Not from emptiness, but reverence. Two maintenance workers in plain gray shirts entered without speaking. One rolled a small stepladder across the tile. The other carried a bronze plaque wrapped in brown paper. They moved with care, as if each footstep might wake something sacred. Near the wall, where the digital touchscreen had gone dark, a curator, not the one who had confronted Samuel earlier, but an older woman with silver hair pulled tight, stood with her hands folded at her waist. Her eyes were glassy. She nodded once, and the men began to work. The drill whirred gently, its sound absorbed by the hush in the room. Visitors stood back, watching as the plaque was leveled, centered, affixed. Outside, on the bench beneath the elm trees, Samuel Riggs remained seated. The flag still lay across his lap. His hands, though veined and weathered, gripped its corners with the precision of a soldier in formation. The general sat beside him again, now silent once more, as he had been that morning, watching from the shadows of the museum's pristine interior. Neither man looked at the window. Neither needed to. The plaque, once mounted, was uncovered by slow hands. Brown paper peeled back to reveal polished metal, its edges beveled, its lettering deep and unmistakable. The Samuel T. Riggs wing in honor of the men who came home quiet. The crowd inside didn't cheer, but the room breathed. Hands came to hearts. Hats were removed. A man near the front dropped to one knee, not from ceremony, but because his legs gave out under the weight of what he had just read. And still, Samuel sat outside, his eyes not on the wall, but on the sky above the trees. The late sun filtered through the branches, casting gold over his shoulders. For the first time that day, his shoulders seemed lighter. A boy, the same one who had posed earlier by the mannequin, stepped out of the museum with his father. He held a small American flag in his hand, the paper stick clutched tightly. He approached the bench without hesitation. His father followed, slower. The boy stood before Samuel and raised the flag, not to wave it, but to offer it. "For you, sir," he said, voice small, eyes steady. Samuel took it gently. The boy's hands were warm. Samuel's own were cool to the touch, but steady. He nodded once. "Thank you, son." The boy smiled, then turned and walked back to his father. The general rose. He moved not toward the building, but toward the maintenance workers now loading their tools back onto a cart. "Leave the lights off," he said softly. They stopped mid-motion, nodded. Inside the Korean War wing, the digital screen remained dark. In its place, the plaque gleamed under the softened light. Not flashy, not loud, but true. The old exhibit had spoken in statistics. Now it spoke in names. Outside, more veterans had begun to arrive. Word had spread, not through email or event listings, but in the way it always had, quietly, across back fences, barbershops, breakfast diners, and Friday morning coffee halls. They came not in uniform, but in memory. Each one found a place near the path, not to stand in lines, not to pose for pictures, just to be there, to bear witness, to remember what the museum had forgotten, until now. A week later, the heat had broken. The last of summer's fury had softened into something tolerable, the kind of warmth that wrapped the skin rather than pressed against it. The elm trees on the museum lawn had begun to brown at the edges. Their leaves, once defiant, now surrendered one by one to the coming season. Samuel Riggs returned as he always had, alone, on foot, one slow step at a time. His coat was lighter this time. The air no longer required it, but the habit of wearing it was harder to shed than wool. It carried him like armor, frayed at the seams but still dignified. At his side, the cane tapped against the pavement, steady as a metronome, each step punctuated with careful precision. The bench was waiting. But it was no longer just a bench. Its frame had been repainted. The iron worked smooth, the wood sanded and sealed. A small plaque had been added to the backrest, carved in brass and darkened for contrast. Reserved in honor, Samuel T. Riggs, Corporal, Korean Campaign, seated here. Each August. He read the words once, then sat. No ceremony, no pause. Just a slow exhale as he folded himself into the seat like returning to formation after a long patrol. He reached into his coat and pulled out the same foil-wrapped sandwich. It had cooled on the walk. The edges were soft, the bread pressed flat from the pressure of being carried. He unwrapped it, smoothed the foil beside him on the bench, and took a small, slow bite. The mustard stung a little on his tongue, but he welcomed it. It was real. It was sharp. It was present. Footsteps approached. Not many, just two. A young man, maybe 25, in jeans and a plain white shirt, carrying a thermos in one hand and a folded flag in the other, approached the bench with careful steps. He didn't speak right away, just stood in front of the old man for a moment, uncertain of protocol. "May I sit?" he asked. Samuel looked up. His eyes, clouded at the edges, still saw clearly enough to read the hesitation. He nodded. "Only if you're not in a rush." The young man smiled and sat. He placed the thermos on the ground between them. "My grandfather told me about you," he said. "He was with the motor pool. Said you rerouted a signal line once that kept his whole unit from driving into a minefield." Samuel chewed slowly, swallowed. "Don't remember the minefield. Remember the motor pool." He smiled faintly. "We traded socks. His were newer." The young man chuckled. "He said you gave him your dry pair. Said you always gave people your dry pair." They fell into silence after that, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled, the kind that settles into the spaces between memory and reverence. The young man didn't touch the flag. He just held it across his lap, hands resting gently atop the folds. From down the path, another figure approached. David McKinley. No uniform, no press. Just a cup of gas station coffee in one hand and a newspaper tucked under his arm. His walk was a little stiffer this time. The dignity of age had caught up with him too. He nodded once to the young man, then turned to Samuel. "Mind if I join you two?" Samuel scooted slightly on the bench as if making room, though none was needed. "Long as you don't mind mustard," he replied. David sat with the weight of memory settling beside him. He placed the coffee on the foil, not as a coaster, but as a gesture, a sharing. They sat together in the shadow of the museum. No speeches, no music, no flash photography. Just three men. One old enough to remember the snow, one young enough to carry its story, one who had built a career on the signal that saved him. A breeze passed through the trees, rustling the leaves above like applause held in the canopy. The flag above the museum door, now flown daily in Samuel's name, rippled gently against its line. Visitors passed by from time to time. Some stopped. Some stared. Some took photos from a distance, unsure of the moment but respectful enough not to interrupt. One child approached, a girl this time, 7 or 8, dragging a worn stuffed bear by one arm. She looked up at the men on the bench and pointed to the flag in the young man's lap. "Was that yours?" Samuel looked down at it, then at her. "No," he said softly. "It's yours." She blinked. "Mine? Yours to remember. Yours to keep safe. Yours to pass on." She didn't fully understand. Not yet. But the words planted something, the way seeds settle deep before they bloom. She nodded, then turned and skipped back to her parents. The men watched her go. The young man turned to Samuel. "Will you be back next year?" Samuel looked forward, eyes fixed on the sky beyond the rooftops. "If I'm not," he said, "keep the bench warm." The three of them sat in quiet communion as the sun began to tip westward, their shadows stretching long across the pavement, merging at the feet of the bronze soldier, who stood forever at attention just a few yards away. They didn't speak of war. They didn't speak of medals. They simply honored each other's presence, each other's silence, and the long, slow echo of service that never really ends. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.